It's time now for French Connections, our weekly look at the intricacies of life here in France with Florence Villeminot.
Hey, Jeannie.
Hi, Flo. The campaign is in full swing for the French presidential election. Today we're going to look behind the scenes at the rules, which are very strict, surrounding French campaigning, particularly when it comes to the money.
Well, running for president is expensive. You know, you have to hire a team, run a website, print posters and flyers. You have to zigzag across the country. And then you have to hold some very expensive campaign meetings. It all adds up. Now, in France, it's nothing compared to the dizzying billions that are spent for the race to the White House. It's relatively cheap and it's highly regulated. There's some very strict rules on spending. Let's take a look. Candidates can't splash out more than 16.8 million euros for round one, and those who make it to round two must not spend over 22.5 million euros. Spending over those amounts is illegal.
There's even a financial incentive to following those very strict guidelines. If candidates do, the state actually pays them back.
It all depends on what percentage of the vote they get. Let's take a look. Candidates that get less than 5% of the vote in the first round, well, they only get about 800,000 euros back. Those who make the 5% cut get about 8 million euros. So you can see there's a lot of pressure to get that 5%. Now, for candidates who make it to round two, well, the state pays them back just under half of what they spent on their campaign, so long as it's under that 22.5 million euro cutoff.
And the state also helps candidates kick off their campaign. Any candidate who reaches the requirement to run for office gets a loan of 150,000 euros.
And the thinking is that this system guarantees candidates a certain amount of independence. They're not depending on, super PACs or special interest groups like they would elsewhere, but they don't get all their money from the state. They can also borrow money from banks. They can get donations from individuals, which are limited to 4,600 euros per person, and they can get tax rebates on that. And they can also get contributions from their political parties.
Despite that, candidates still count on those subsidies, but they don't always get them. And that was the case of the former French president, Nicolas Sarkozy, 5 years ago when he launched his failed re-election bid.
There were several issues with his campaign financing in 2012. First of all, he filed expenses over that 22.5 million limit, and therefore he didn't get a single euro back from the state. Now, it later emerged, though, that he had grossly overspent during that campaign, spending nearly twice as much as the legal limit. And not only that, he was accused of doing so in an illegal, backhanded way. To avoid the kind of scandal that took place after that, a special independent commission has been set up for this election to crunch the numbers. But it's interesting because critics say that the whole system needs to change. France needs to wake up and just raise those spending limits.
One thing candidates don't have to spend a lot of money on are TV and radio ads. In fact, political ads are banned.
It's really interesting. Only a small number of statements by candidates are allowed to be broadcast, and they have to follow some very strict rules when it comes to timing and editing. And this leads to a very interesting aspect of French politics, and that's that France has a very egalitarian view when it comes to candidates' access to mass media. Take a look. It's really interesting. By law, all candidates are given equal time on the television and the radio during the official campaign, and that official campaign is 5 weeks before round one. So if an anchor, you can see it happening here on a public or a private channel, interviews a big candidate on prime time, for instance, well, they have to interview a smaller candidate also on prime time for the same length of time over the coming days, even if it's a really small candidate that's only polling at around 1%.
And that airtime and that media exposure is carefully monitored and carefully enforced by a special state watchdog called the CSA.
That's right, the Conseil Supérieur de l'Audiovisuel, the CSA. It's a high council that quite literally counts the amount of time each candidate speaks. It's called the temps de parole. The temps de parole is our word du jour, and it's definitely something you hear a lot about during the presidential campaign. So the CSA hires people to quite literally watch TV and log the seconds that each candidate talks or is talked about on TV or on the radio, and this log is cross-referenced with internal logs from broadcast companies. Like here at France 24, our French channel has to be in touch with the CSA regularly to monitor the situation.
Croyez-moi, je ne le dis pas avec plaisir. Je le regrette profondément.
Voilà, donc là c'est du temps de parole.
Well, that's pure speech time, so I'm going to log it. You have to be precise and count each second, because it adds up to a lot of time in the end.
Il faut savoir qu'on le fait main dans la
We
main
work hand in
avec les
hand
chaînes.
with
On
TV
s'appelle tous les
channels.
jours,
We call them
parfois
every
pour se
day, sometimes
réprimander,
to
parfois
reprimand
pour
them,
encourager,
sometimes to encourage
mais
them.
on s'appelle tous les jours et c'est un travail qu'on fait
We do this regularly
pendant
throughout
toute
the year,
l'année,
but
mais
it's
qui est
more
plus
intense
intense
during the
pendant
election
les périodes
period.
électorales.
Now, that system does have a lot of critics who say that it actually weakens the political debate.
Indeed, critics say that with so many smaller candidates hogging airtime, important issues kind of get watered down. You don't really have enough time to get into the nitty-gritty of different candidates' programs, and the more candidates, the more the coverage is superficial. That's what critics say. But the system also has a lot of defenders because essentially it enables the emergence of small candidates who probably wouldn't really have a chance otherwise. So it encourages the rejuvenation of democracy and ultimately exposes voters to a wider range of candidates and ideas.
It's true. At least we know their voices are being heard. Florence Villeminot, thank you so much for that look at how the presidential campaign actually works here in France. Don't forget, if you have any questions for Flo, other things that you'd like to ask her about, you can always send her a tweet at Flo Villeminot.